Chapter 11, Mediterranean Society, the Roman Face. Rome was founded in 8th century BCE and was originally a small city-state in a monarchy. Paul of Tarsus. Paul of Tarsus was a prisoner because he had promoted Christian faith. He was found guilty and later executed because Christianity was seen as a threat to peace and stability of Rome. He had expanded Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. Etruscans in Rome. The Etruscans migrated from Anatolia to Italy to then settle in modern Florence. They had controlled much of the territory from Po River Valley to Naples. The Kingdom of Rome was a monarchy ruled like Etruscan cities. They had paved streets, public buildings, defensive walls, and large temples. They had easy access to Mediterranean because of the Tiber River. Roman Republic and Constitution. In 509 BCE, Romans had converted to an aristocratic republic. A Roman Forum was built, which is a political and civic center filled with temples and public buildings. They had instituted a republican constitution that entrusted executive responsibilities to 2 consuls for civil and military. Patricians were aristocrats. There were usually tensions between plebeians and patricians. Plebeians were given tribunes, and as time passed, Rome broadened political participation. Expansion of the Republic. Rome had gained control of Italy in 4th and 5th century BCE. They had established military colonies and had a generous policy for people they conquered. This policy had allowed them to govern their own internal affairs. They had forbidden any political or military alliances with anyone but Rome. Carthage was a dominant political power in North Africa, southern part of Iberian Peninsula, and the western region of Sicily. The Romans had battled with Carthage in Punic Wars between 264 and 146 BCE. Rome fought major wars in Macedon and Anatolia against Antinagid and Seleucid empires between 215 and 148 BCE. After this, they had entrusted them as allies into the region. Imperial expansion and domestic problems. Wealthy elites that organized plantations were called latifundia. They had used slave labor. The Gracchi brothers had sought to limit the amount of conquered land that an individual could own. Gaius Marius was a general that sided with social reformers who advocated to redistribute land because they were loyal to the general. Lucius Sulla allied with conservatives and aristocrats. Sulla seized Rome in 83 BCE and ordered for his enemies to be executed. The foundation of empire. General Marius had a nephew named Julius Caesar that had favored liberal policies and social reform. He had played an active role in politics. He had spent large amounts of money to please the public to achieve a good reputation. He had conquered Gaul and was then dictator. He had made jobs for people with building projects. In 44 BCE, he was stabbed to death. After Julius Caesar had died, his nephew Augustus came to power. During a naval battle at Octum in 31 BCE, Augustus had defeated his rival, Mark Antony, who joined forces with Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt. Augustus had centralized political and military power and had created a new army with commanders who owed allegiance directly to the emperor. Augustus overall had stabilized Rome. He had died on 14 CE.
Continuing expansion and integration of the empire. During Republican times, Rome already held Italy, Greece, Syria, Gaul, and most of the Iberian Peninsula. By Augustus's reign, imperial holdings included much of southeastern Europe, most of North Africa, including Egypt, and sizable territories in Anatolia and Southwest Asia. At its highest point during early 2nd century Common Era, the Roman Empire embraced much of Britain, as well as a continuous belt surrounding the Mediterranean. Romans entered populated lands like Gaul and Britain, which stimulated and developed local economies. The Pax Romana was a long era of Roman peace created by Augustus that facilitated trade and communication throughout Rome. The 12 Tables, which was established 450 before Common Era, was a basic law code for citizens at the early Republic. During the late Republic, jurists articulated standards of justice and gradually applied them throughout the Roman Empire. Defendants were innocent until proven guilty and permitted judges to set aside laws that were unfair. Economy and society in the Roman Mediterranean. Good roads and the Pax Romana encouraged trade, and Romans built a strictly patriarchal society using extensive slave labor. Trade and urbanization. Owners of latifundia concentrated agricultural production for export from Egypt, Africa, and Sicily for grain. This was easily done because they would export from areas that produced large surpluses, and this would lower the price. Greece produced olives and vines, Gaul, grain, copper and vines, Syria and Palestine, fruits, nuts and wool, Italy, pottery, glass, bronze, and Spain, high-quality olive oil, wine, horses, and precious metals. Sea lanes linked ports from Syria and Palestine to Spain and North Africa. Roman naval power kept sea free of pirates. The Mediterranean trade fueled remarkable urban development. 1st century CE, 10,000 statues, 700 pools, 500 fountains, 36 marbles decorated the city of Rome, along with the finance of aqueducts, temples, and other public buildings. Construction with concrete was way more efficient and employed hundreds of thousands of Romans. Roman cities provided luxuries with sewers, baths, and stadiums. Family and society. The Roman family consisted of slaves, servants, and close family. The eldest male, paterfamilias, was able by Roman law to arrange marriages, determine work, punish, and sell people to slavery or even execute them. Women were often influential and found loopholes in Roman law. Rich lived in luxury, while poverty was huge in 1st century BCE, and this caused riots. But imperial authorities kept masses content with bread and circuses. Slaves represented 1/3 of the Roman population, and during 73 BCE, Spartacus, a slave, assembled an army of 70,000 runaway slaves. Greek philosophy and religions of salvation. Romans believed in many gods and goddesses, Jupiter being the most powerful. They adopted deities of other peoples. 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the most prominent school of thought in the Hellenistic Greece was Stoicism. Marcus Tullius Cicero, 106 through 43 BCE, drew heavily from Stoicis's moral and ethical teachings as a Roman intellectual, and he helped establish Stoicism as the most prominent school of philosophy. Under the Roman Empire, religions of salvation arose reflecting the political and social problems of the time. Mithraism became very popular among soldiers, associating it with virtues such as strength and courage, and provided divine sanction for human life. The cult of Isis was the most popular until Christianity, which is a place for men and women to help cope with life through nurture. Judaism and Christianity. Jewish people maintained faith in communities under various imperial regimes. To encourage loyalty, States made cults that would portray emperors as gods, and this was a problem. It was very problematic for monotheistic Jews.
Hey guys, this is Logie Wilson coming at you with Chapter 20, Western Europe during the High Middle Ages. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe button below, and I hope you enjoy the video. Alright guys, so this all started with the Carolingian Empire fading in the 9th century, leading to local leaders establishing regional states in Western Europe, and by mid-10th century Otto of Saxony established himself king in northern Germany. He ventured into modern Eastern Germany, Western Poland, Czech Republic, and Italy. Pope John XII thought he was so chill that he crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in 962 CE. The Holy Roman Empire had a vision of imperial unity in Europe, but struggled to do so due to power complications with the church, so that kind of backfired. One of the most famous examples of power struggles between church and state was the investiture conquest, a controversy over the appointment of church officials in the 11th and 12th centuries. What happened was our boy Pope Gregory VII ordered an end to the selection of church officials via imperial authorities, but our boy Emperor Henry IV challenged this, and so the Pope excommunicated him, leading to German princes retaliating and pretty much destroying much of Emperor Henry's stuff. And so this diminished imperial authority and lifted papal authority, especially since Emperor Henry begged the Pope to not excommunicate him. Aside from the Holy Roman Empire, two other states also emerged. When the last of the Carolingians died in 987, the lords of France elected Hugh Capet to serve as king. His descendants, known as the Capetian kings, gradually centralized power in France by the 14th century. Also, Normans, who originated in the state of Normandy, France under the Carolingian Empire, broke off, and in 1060, Duke William of Normandy invaded England, defeating Germanic tribes and introducing Norman principles of government. Along with the Holy Roman Empire, France, and English states, regional states also appeared in Italy and Iberia. The Pope ruled the papal state in central Italy, influencing daily life and political decisions heavily. During the High Middle Ages, papal authority weakened, although it remained strong in northern Italy. During the 8th and 11th century, Muslim states were able to conquer most of the Iberian Peninsula. However, later on, due to Christian invasion, Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal were able to regain most of the peninsula. In Italy, neighboring states competed for power. However, those same prosperous states that dominated Italy and its hinterlands were able to lay the foundation for a much more powerful kingdom of Naples that would soon dominate Italy. Like China, India, and the Islamic world, increased agricultural production was the foundation for economic and social growth. Expanding population created selective pressures on landlords to expand cultivation, thus increasing agricultural production. This increase in agricultural production and finance allowed them to raise taxes on peasants, ultimately backfiring. Due to increasing agricultural yield and growing economic flexibility, cultivators experimented with different methods and cycles of crop rotation, increasing cultivation of especially beans, which were known to enrich the land because of their property of fixing nitrogen in the soil. Techniques were then written in vernacular languages and published. Inventions such as horseshoes prevented softness and splitted hooves, and horse collars allowed horses to pull heavy plows without choking. In 800 CE, the European population was at 3.6 million, and with new crops like rice, oranges, and limes, and trade allowing fish to enter European diets, it added variation, and by 1300 CE, the population had reached to 79 million, its all-time high before the plague. The growth of towns and cities brought emerging specialization of labor, leading to a huge expression of manufacturing and trade. Trade in wool and textiles was among the most prominent. However, Mediterranean trade embraced cities like Naples and Venice, exchanging salt, olive oil, and wine with Asian and Muslim merchants for luxury goods such as gems, spices, and silk. They established commercial pacts, such as a handstake league, which was a well-developed trade network in the Baltic and North Sea, dominating northern European trade. Along with the emergence of towns and cities, emerged a new social order, the three estates: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. Those who prayed were known as Roman Catholic officials and clergy members. Those who fought were nobles and knights, and those who worked, peasants and serfs. Those who worked usually faced social inequality, living off laws of the Lord, often making it hard for justice. Chivalry, a high ethical standards of cordial behavior, was often noticed by nobles and church officials who devoted themselves to order, piety, and Christianity. Aristocratic women such as the troubadours found this to their liking, as guys weren't being as big of jerks. As urban population grew, towns were able to resist the Lord's power. Merchants and workers formed guilds to regulate production and sales of goods, and showed communal support for members. Women dominated production and textiles in urban cities. However, they lacked very many basic rights in this patriarchal society. During the early Middle Ages, European society was not stable or wealthy enough to support institutions of advanced education. As there was a sharp increase in demand for educated individuals in the early 11th century, bishops and archbishops of France and northern Italy organized schools and cathedrals, establishing a formal curricula based on writings in Latin and concentrating on liberal arts such as literature and philosophy. On another note, St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274, saw no contradictions between the teachings of Aristotle and the teachings of the Bible. Western European scholars learned about Aristotle first from Muslim philosophers while trading. By the mid-12th century, students and teachers organized academic guilds persuading political authorities to grant charters, demanding fair treatment. This had an effect to transform these cathedral schools into prominent universities. The first ones instructed law, theology, and medicine at Paris and Bologna. Formal doctrine and theology in the Roman Catholic Church, however, were not as popular as ceremonies and sacraments. The Church recognized 7 sacraments or holy rituals, the most popular being the Eucharist, an offering a ritual meal to Jesus. This is often performed weekly or daily, depending on devotion. The most popular saint was the Virgin Mary. As a woman of love, devotion, and sympathy, she recognized much for the Roman Catholic Church. Pilgrimages were usually to Rome, Italy, and Spain. During the 13th century, Saint Dominic and Saint Francis founded an order of beggars known as the Dominican and Franciscans. They wandered the streets, ridding themselves of personal possessions, praying in exchange for food. The Roman Catholic Church worked to combat heterodox movements and persuade heretics to return to the Church. Heretics such as the Waldensians and Cathars were most active in southern France and northern Italy. They despised the Roman Catholic Church as corrupt. They chose to lead more simple, modest lives and viewed the world as a struggle between good and evil. The Cathars, however, were almost exterminated when the Roman Catholic Church attacked them, killing most of their members. When regional states emerged to protect Western Europe from Vikings, Scandinavian seafarers went to the islands of the North Atlantic Ocean. About 1000 CE, Leif Erikson led an expedition to Canada, founding a colony and maintaining it for several decades, calling it Vinland, later being forced to flee because of lack of resources. Once Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland converted to Christianity in the 10th, 12th, and 14th centuries, Christians formed military religious orders such as the Teutonic Knights in the Baltic region. Their main efforts waged against the lives of the Slavic peoples, However, they founded many churches and monasteries in the regions they subdued. During the 9th century, Muslim armies had conquered the island of Sicily. However, during the 11th century, Norman warriors and Roger Guiscard retook Sicily in 1090 and established Christian authority. Missionaries and clergy appeared as Islamic peoples slowly converted or fled. Reconquista of Spain began in 1060 and established authority over half of Spain by 1150. However, the Kingdom of Granada survived as a Muslim kingdom until 1492, when Christians finally established authority over the entirety of Spain. Pope Urban II was the first to launch a crusade in 1095, calling for Christian knights to seize the Holy Land, promising salvation for those who die in battle. Within a year, a preacher named Peter the Hermit gathered an army of poor knights and peasants with no training, discipline, weapons, supplies, or plans. They fought Greeks and Turks along the way, and often themselves. Those who did not die were captured, and few returned back. However, the next crusade in 1096, arranged by French and Norman nobles, captured Edessa, Anatolia, and Jerusalem in 1099. This victory encouraged Muslim leader Saladin to recapture Jerusalem in 1187, where the Christians would never get it back. Many of the later crusades were failed attempts, including the Fourth Crusade, which went astray as they attacked Constantinople, badly damaging it so it can be later conquered by the Ottomans. Despite the crusades being an utter failure, they did lead to eager trading of ideas between Christian and Muslim theologians, later leading to the discovery of Arabic numerals, paper production, and teachings of Aristotle. This exchange also led to more luxury goods, food, and agricultural products between the two cultures.
Chapter 25, The New Worlds, the Americas, and Oceania. Spanish Caribbean. The Taínos were the most prominent people in the Caribbean. They cultivated manioc and other crops. They showed interest in the glass beads and metal tools that Spanish mariners brought to trade. After a few years, the Spanish mariners realized that the Caribbean region had nothing to offer. So they attempted to support their society by mining gold, and they used a labor recruitment system called the encomienda system, which gave settlers the right to compel Taínos to work in their mines and fields, and in return the Taínos received health and welfare and were encouraged to convert to Christianity. The Caribbean islands offered ideal conditions for cash crops, which would fetch high prices in European markets. Tobacco also became a prime cash crop along with sugar. Because indigenous populations became extinct, they imported several million slaves, and by the 1700s, the Caribbean population consisted of a small class of European administrators and large masses of African slaves. By 1515, social disruption and physical abuse brought the decline to the Taino populations on large Caribbean islands, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Also due to epidemic disease, the native population decreased from about 4 million in 1492 to a few thousand in the 1540s. Conquest of Mexico and Peru. Between 1519 and 1521, Hernán Cortés and a small band of men brought down the Aztec Empire in Mexico. Between 1532 and 1533, Francisco Pizarro and his followers brought down the Incan Empire in Peru. During the siege of Tenochtitlan, smallpox raged through the city, killing inhabitants by tens of thousands, and sapped the strength of defensive forces. Smallpox also raced through Mexico, making the Aztec society unable to function. Francisco Pizarro and his conquistadors looted gold and silver from Cusco's temples and public buildings, melted down statuettes made of precious metals, and even took jewelry and ornaments from the bodies of the deceased Incan rulers. Iberian empires in the Americas. The viceroys were the king's representatives in the Americas. Audiencias heard appeals against the viceroy's decisions and policies and had the right to address their concerns directly to the king. They also conducted reviews of viceroy's performance at the end of their terms. Negative reviews led to severe punishment. In Portuguese Brazil, in 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world along an imaginary north-south line 370 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. According to this agreement, Spain could claim any land west of that line, therefore Portugal gained Brazil. Settler colonies in North America. French settlers established colonies at Port Royal in 1604 and Quebec in 1608. English migrants founded Jamestown in 1607 and the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. During the 17th and 18th centuries, French settled in eastern Canada, and they built forts all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Most settlers focused more on producing valuable commodities such as fur, pitch, tar, and lumber rather than growing crops. They heavily relied on provisions sent from Europe and avoided starvation with the help from the natives. In Jamestown, food shortage and disease was so severe that 60 out of the 500 of the inhabitants made it through the winter of 1609 through 1610. Some settlers resorted to cannibalism. Many indigenous peoples of eastern North America practiced agriculture and also relied on hunting. They didn't claim ownership of territory but regularly migrated. European settlers saw forested lands not bearing crops and stocked out farms. Availability of fertile farmland attracted large numbers of European migrants. English settlers negotiated rights to American lands by treaty. Natives didn't appreciate the English law and mounted many raids on farms and villages. In 1492, indigenous population was greater than 5 million, maybe even 10. By the mid-16th century, smallpox and other diseases had begun to spread, and by the 1800s, indigenous peoples in the territory of present-day U.S. numbered only 600,000. Formation of multicultural societies. In Spanish and Portuguese colonies, migrants born in Europe stood at the top of the social hierarchy, followed by criollos or creoles who were born in the Americas of Iberian parents. In all Iberian colonies, imported slaves and conquered peoples stood at the bottom of the social hierarchy. In North American colonies, women were more numerous and settlers mostly married within their own groups. Métis were a child of French and Native Americans, French fur traders usually. Mingling of Native Americans with English settlers was uncommon because colonists viewed the natives as lazy heathens. Mining and agriculture in the Spanish Empire. Precious metals in the Americas drew thousands of migrants from all levels of Spanish society. Silver far outweighed gold in quantity and value. Silver production concentrated on the thinly populated Mexican north and the high cold central Andes. Both sites employed large numbers of indigenous laborers. The Mita system recruited workers for particularly difficult and dangerous chores that the free laborers wouldn't accept. Death rates of draft laborers were high, and many men often fled to cities or hid in distant villages. European merchants traded silver for silk, spices, and porcelain in Asian markets. American silver quickly traveled throughout the world and powerfully stimulated global trade. The hacienda, which was the most prominent site of agricultural and craft production, produced foodstuffs for its own use as well as for sale to local markets in nearby mining districts, towns, and cities. The products of the hacienda were mostly of European origin, which was wheat, grapes, and meat from pigs and cattle. The major source of labor was the indigenous population. Spanish landowners advanced loans to native peoples so they could buy supplies to work crops.
Natives repaid loans with labor, but wages were so low that they were never able to pay off their debts. Therefore, landowners had a captive labor force to work their estates. This caused resistance from indigenous peoples, which took various forms of rebellion, half-hearted work, and retreat into the mountains and forests where Spanish power did not reach. Guaman Poma, a native of Peru, wrote of men ruined by overtaxation and women driven to prostitution. He also complained of disease and abuse. Sugar and slavery in Portuguese Brazil. Portuguese nobles and entrepreneurs established sugar plantations in places without machinery and therefore relied on African slaves instead as laborers. Africans and their descendants became the majority of the Brazilian population. The engenho referred to the sugar mill, but also represented a complex of labor, buildings, animals, capital, and technical skills. Portuguese planters and owners of sugar mills exercised political, social, and economic power. They also usually counted on royal support. Portuguese plantation managers imported African slaves as early as the 1530s and began to rely on African labor on a large scale in the 1580s. Slaves endured terrible working conditions, mistreatment, tropical heat, poor nutrition, and inadequate housing. This typically produced high rates of disease and mortality. Government officials mostly left labor management matters to the slave owners. They paid no attention to the preservation of slaves' lives as long as the owner realized the profits. Because of this, the owners had little economic motivation to improve conditions for slaves. The business of producing Brazilian sugar was so harsh that every ton of sugar cost one human life. North American fur trade began when fishermen bartered for fur with local peoples. They found the Hudson Strait and the Hudson Bay both convenient entrances to rich fur-producing regions. Indigenous peoples trapped animals for Europeans and exchanged the pelts for manufactured goods such as wool blankets, iron pots, firearms, and distilled spirits. European capitalist markets experienced burgeoning demand for beaver skin, hats, and fur clothing. American beaver populations declined rapidly when hunting grounds became depleted, native peoples poached and invaded other territories, which frequently led to war. Plantations created high demand for cheap labor. They recruited indentured servants from Europe, which were people who basically had no future. They were willing to sell a portion of their working lives in exchange for passage across the Atlantic to start a new life. Many indentured servants hoped that after serving 4 to 7 years of labor, they'd become independent artisans or planters. The reality was that many of them died of disease or overwork, while others found only marginal employment. But most eventually gained their freedom, while others remained servants all their lives. North America found uses for slave labor in Africa. In 1661, Virginia law recognized all blacks as slaves. After 1680, planters increasingly replaced indentured servants with African slaves. Slave labor wasn't popular in northern colonies because of the land and climate, which were not suitable for cultivation of labor. But these colonies profited handsomely from slavery. Many New England merchants traded slaves destined for the West Indies. Economies of New York and Philadelphia benefited from the building and outfitting of slave vessels, and the seaports of New England became profitable centers for the distillation of rum. The chief ingredient for rum was slave-produced sugar from the West Indies. Merchants traded much of this distilled spirits for slaves on the African coast. Christianity and native religions in the Americas. Dominican and Jesuit missionaries campaigned to Christianize indigenous peoples. They learned the natives' languages and explained Christianity so that their audiences could correctly understand. In both Mexico and Peru, native peoples still honored idols in caves and hard-to-reach mountain sites. Many have still occasionally continued to sacrifice human victims. Because of epidemic disease, many leaders in Mexico believed that their gods had abandoned them, and so they looked to the missionaries for spiritual guidance. When natives adopted Christianity, they blended their own traditions with it. In the mid-17th century, Christianity especially became popular in Mexico, as a mestizo society took the Virgin of Guadalupe almost as a national symbol. The site where, according to legend, the Virgin Mary appeared became a popular shrine mostly visited by Spanish settlers, and by the 1640s, pilgrims from all parts of Mexico visited this shrine. It was much more difficult for French and English colonists to convert natives to Christianity, seeing as the natives always moved around the countryside. So colonists displayed no interest in converting them to Christianity and made little effort to seek converts. Australia and the larger world. Portuguese mariners most likely charted much of the western and northern coast of Australia as early as the 1520s. Mariners found little to no encouraging efforts. Europeans considered the Aboriginal peoples of Australia savages. European mariners made no effort to establish permanent settlements in Australia. James Cook charted the southeast region in 1770 and reported that the area was suitable for settlement. In 1788, a British fleet brought 1,000 passengers. 800 of these passengers were convicts. Pacific Islands and the larger world. Before reaching the Philippines, Ferdinand Magellan and his crew encountered the marinas dominated by Guam. In 1565, Spanish mariners began the Manila galleon trade between Manila and Acapulco. Primary goal was to link New Spain to Asian markets. Guam lay directly between the route from Acapulco to Manila. They took fresh provisions and engaged in peaceful trade with the indigenous Chamorro people. In the 1670s and 1680s, Spaniards decided to consolidate their position in Guam and take control of the Marina Islands. Spanish mariners frequently visited Tahiti after 1767. They received provisions and engaged in sexual relations with Tahitian women in exchange for nails, knives, iron tools, and textiles. In 1778, James Cook came across the Hawaiian Islands and over time was able to communicate with Polynesian languages. They traded pigs and provisions for ironwares.
Chapter 29, Revolutions and National States in the Atlantic World. During this era, revolutionaries attacked monarchical and aristocratic regimes and argued for popular sovereignty. Americans and the French were highly influenced by the Enlightenment values and ideas. For example, John Locke made one of the most influential theories of contractual government. Written in his second treatise of civil government, his thought relocated sovereignty, vesting power in people of society. Enlightenment thinkers also called for freedom and equality, such as Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Voltaire called for religious toleration and freedom to express their views openly. Rousseau wrote The Social Contract in 1762. The American Revolution began when financial difficulties arose from the 7 Years' War. The British tightened control over colonies by their imposition of taxes on different items, such as the Stamp Act, Township Act, and Tea Act. The colonies then protested against these British policies and boycotted these taxes. An example of this would be the Boston Tea Party. Americans then created the Declaration of Independence, which drew deep inspiration from John Locke by its use of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It called for his contractual theory of government. At the beginning of the War for Independence, George Washington was the military leader for colonial army, and the American rebels got support from different allies, such as France, Spain, the Netherlands, etc. British forces surrendered in October 1781, and in September 1873, the Peace of Paris was created and the British recognized American independence. Americans then established their own government under the creation of the Constitution of the United States. The French Revolution was also caused by war debts. Huge royal debts compelled Louis XVI to call Estates General meetings. King Louis XVI sought to increase taxes on the French nobility, such as the Third Estate and the Estates General. The Third Estate were against this and seceded and created the National Assembly. In July 1789, a Paris mob stormed the Bastille in fear that the king wanted to undo the events that had early occurred. The National Assembly had popular support and adopted the Declaration of Rights of Man. They passed laws and reforms to promise liberty, equality, and fraternity. This reflects American revolutionary and Enlightenment ideas. The French Revolution soon entered a radical phase, when France declared war on Austria. Revolutionary leaders established the convention which declared France a republic. On January 1793, radical Republicans tried Louis XVI for treason and beheaded him. Revolutionary chaos reached its peak when Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobin Party dominated the convention. They unleashed a terror campaign to promote their agenda. They were then arrested and a new institution called the Directory seized power, led by Napoleon Bonaparte. The reign of Napoleon was from 1799 to 1815. He was a brilliant military leader and became a general in the Royal Army at age 24. He supported the revolution and defended the Directory. His invasion of Egypt was defeated by the British Army and overthrew the Directory and named himself consul for life. He also made a Napoleonic France which brought stability after years of chaos. He made peace with the Roman Catholic Church and Pope and extended freedom of religion to Protestants and Jews. He also made a civil code of 1804, which stated political and legal equality for all adult men. He also made an empire. In 1804, he proclaimed himself emperor. He dominated the European continent, which included Iberia, Italy, and the Netherlands. He defeated Austria and Prussia with his army and fought the British on high seas. His disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 destroyed the Grand Army. The fall of Napoleon included that he was forced by a coalition of enemies to abdicate in 1814 and was exiled on Elba. He escaped, returned to France, raised army, but was defeated by the British in 1815.
The influence of revolution. The Haitian Revolution was the only successful slave revolt ever in history. Saint-Domingue was a French colony on the western Hispaniola. It was dominated by a small white planter class, and the majority of the population were slaves who were working on harsh conditions. There was a large community of escaped slaves and free blacks who fought in the American War, brought back revolutionary ideas. White settlers wanted self-governance, gens de couleur wanted political rights, and slaves wanted freedom. Toussaint Louverture was a son of slaves, literate, and an organizer who built a strong army and controlled Saint-Domingue by 1797. He created a constitution in 1801, but yet arrested by French troops, and later on died in jail in 1803. Wars of Independence in Latin America. In the Latin American society hierarchy, the social classes were the Peninsulares, Criollos, slaves, and indigenous people. Criollos wanted to take out the Peninsulares but still keep their privileged selves. Napoleon's invasion of Spain weakened the royal control over the colonies in South America in 1807. The Mexican peasant revolt was led by Hidalgo in 1810 but defeated by Criollos. In 1821, Mexico had a military dictatorship but then became a republic in 1822. Simon Bolivar was inspired by George Washington and used arms to fight against the Spanish rule in 1811. Creole forces in South America were stronger than the Spanish army. In 1824, the Portuguese royal court went to Rio de Janeiro in 1807. Later in 1821, Pedro became the Emperor Pedro in independent Brazil. Conservatism was the resistance to change, as it was seen by Edmund Burke as an organism that changed slowly over time. The American Revolution was a natural and logical result of history, while the French Revolution is a violent and irresponsible. Liberalism is more fast-paced in change and valued freedom, equality, democracy, and written constitutions. John Stuart Mill promoted individual freedom and minority rights. Beginning in the 1700s, slave trade movements were started and gained momentum during the revolutions. In 1807, the British Parliament banned slave trade. Other countries followed, yet legal slave trade still continued. Abolishment of slavery was more difficult due to property rights. Haiti and other South American countries were independent after the end of slavery. Although it brought legal freedom to slaves, it did not bring political equality. Women used John Locke's ideas to argue for women's rights, to extend the Enlightenment to women. Mary Astell attacked male dominance in family, and Mary Wollstonecraft believes that women have the same rights as men. The French Revolution gave women the rights to education and property, but not to vote. In the Congress of Vienna, leaders wanted to restore old order after Napoleon. They succeeded in maintaining the balance of power in Europe and later on failed to stop nationalist and revolutionary ideas. Nationals fought against old order in the 19th century. Carver and Garibaldi united Italy in 1870. The Young Italy inspired rebellions against foreign rule in Italy. In North Italy, nationalists took out Austrian authorities led by Carver. South Italy was returned to King Emmanuel by 1860 by Garibaldi. Otto von Bismarck created a united Germany. In 1848, Nationalist rebellion was stopped in Germany. Bismarck prompted 3 wars in which swelled German pride. Bismarck became Emperor of the Second Reich in 1871.